Hello, I'm Bridget Sullivan with the Mount Holly Conservation Trust, and in a moment you're going to see a presentation by Dr. Alan Betts on climate change and what we are facing in the future, and more importantly what our children and grandchildren are facing in the future. First of all, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Mount Holly Conservation Trust and a fabulous project we're working on right now. We are in the middle of trying to conserve 350 acres along Route 155 in Mount Holly, and it is the last gap in a corridor of land that has been conserved from Warren, Vermont to the Massachusetts border to protect a wildlife corridor that will allow wildlife to have some climate resilience, hopefully allow them to be able to have habitat, places to find mates and food, so that they can move north and up in elevation as the climate warms. And we are finding that over a 10-year period, there's a large change in habitat for fur-bearing animals, for birds, for insects, all kinds of things. You may be seeing mourning doves here now that we didn't have before in Mount Holly. You may be seeing species that we haven't seen here before because we're up in elevation. And that's because they're moving, adjusting to climate change. So the importance of this corridor that we're trying to protect is that will give them habitat so that they survive, because one of Dr. Betts's points will be that many, many species will go extinct over the next several years. So the corridor that we're trying to protect is the former McLean property at the top of 155, right where the beaver dams are, on the left-hand side of the road as you're going south to Weston. The Conservation Trust, in partnership with the Vermont Land Trust and the state of Vermont, have purchased that land. We now need to raise the money to pay the Vermont Land Trust back, and I'm happy to announce tonight that of an $860,000 project, we are now down to the last $100,000 to raise because of an amazing $100,000 grant from the Vermont Community Foundation that we just received. We are so thrilled. We want to thank Joan Weir from the Vermont Land Trust, who's here, and for working with us over the last year and a half to get this far along. And the state of Vermont is agreed to take it as part of the Okemo State Forest. This project has the headwaters of it has the sources of 3 rivers. It's the headwaters of the West River, which goes down through Weston and then on into Lake Champlain, I believe. No, that one goes to the Connecticut River. And then the Mill River and the Branch Brook go down from this property also. It's an amazing piece of property. It's got ledge habitat for lynx and bobcat. It has bear mast stands, which is great feed for the bear. It has an active beaver pond on it. It's just an amazing piece of property. And one of the great things about it is that it will now allow us as a community to use it again for hunting because it's been posted as no trespassing. It will protect the Vast Trail and the Catamount Trail, which go across it. It will open it up again for dispersed recreation and for supporting wildlife, being able to look at it with supporting wildlife and other things, being able to go out there. It will also reintroduce it into the logging and forestry block that we have, because the state forest will manage it as part of the state forest. It will have a conservation easement on it from the Vermont Land Trust. But we are so excited about this, and we're hoping that you will be as excited as we are and contribute to this project. It's a very exciting project, and as I say, it connects. It's the last piece to make a continuous connection for 100 miles long. Without the Nineveh Foundation and many other groups around, this wouldn't be possible. But they have been conserving land around Lake Nineveh. We've done some projects in the past to connect across 103, and the Vermont Land Trust and the Conservation Fund have all been part of this effort over the years. So we're very excited to announce this $100,000 grant. It's a challenge grant, asking people to come up with the final $100,000 for this project of an $865,000 project. So we hope you'll all support us. We thank you very much, And without further ado, we'll go to Dr. Betts.
The issue has moved way beyond what is happening and the scale of it, way beyond the science of what is happening, to why are we unable as a society, and this is particularly true of the US society, to actually begin to deal with it. It's something we've known for 30 or 40 years. The first Academy report was 1979, which I think is 40 years ago, this date. And all the oil companies knew about it then, they'd done all the research themselves. And they had spent 40 years covering things up. And we have gone along for the ride. So let me begin, otherwise we'll never get going. It's a good thing I don't have to discuss with Dick McCormack why the legislature hasn't done anything much this year. And I will not fill in for him. So I'm going to talk a bit about the science, global and local, what's happening to Vermont, because that grounds it for all of you, and I find it's very useful for the state. But I'm going to move on to the catastrophe issue, because partly this has become much more obvious in the last 5 years, and partly it's now becoming a global issue. The issue of how can we stabilize the climate? Well, we've actually known how to stabilize the climate for several decades now, but we've refused to do it for political reasons. But what's come very much into the fore is what are our real responsibilities to our own children and our grandchildren, the generations coming, and to the Earth itself. And I want to raise that explicitly and discuss what's happening there. And the underlying question, which has become very much to the fore, some of you will know the 16-year-old Greta, who started this protest in Sweden last fall. It's been going less than a year, when the youth has realized in less than 1 year that they are going to be sacrificed. And they're going to, around the world, they're saying, this is unacceptable. And September the 20th, there'll be one of the big strikes on a global scale by youth. But our question for us, all of us except perhaps the youngest in this room, is are we willing to sacrifice them just to maintain the status quo? Keep the rich rich, the big companies rich, the oil companies in business, maximizing their billions of profit every year. We understand the various strategies which will give us a resilient society. What I'm going to talk a bit about are the technological and ecological issues, but behind that is we actually have to place great value in the future. And traditionally, in our economic system, the future has no value. We value things for the profit this quarter. We can engineer for efficiency and resilience, but that means rejecting the present rule by which we do something. We say, oh, it's not cost effective. And not cost effective means it's not cost effective for today's bottom line, where the future is worthless. We have to ask the question, we have to reject that and ask, is it cost effective for the Earth and cost effective for our kids? And the underlying thing there is that if we spend $1 trillion on climate resilience now, doing the things we should have done last decade, we save $60 trillion later this century. $60 trillion that again our children and grandchildren will not be able to pay, because the total here is now around about 1,000 trillion. So the underlying message that I'm going to circle around to is that if we ignore climate change, it's not that we can't fix it now if we really move in the next few years. The costs both to human civilization and the Earth's ecosystem become catastrophic within our children's lifetime. So it's a community issue, it's a resilience and a resistance issue. But to step back into the fundamentals, what was happened is we discovered the fossil fuels, and that drove everything. It was massive amounts of cheap energy. It drove the Industrial Revolution. It drove, for example, the massive growth of the United States economy after World War II. We controlled the global oil supply, and we controlled the price at $3 a barrel. But that didn't realize at the beginning, a couple of hundred years ago when it began in England, that it would transform the climate. We've only known that for about 40 years. The water processes, water vapor and ice, amplify a lot. I'll say a little bit about that. And we're heading, as we burn all the Fossil fuels, which were taken out of the atmosphere 300 million years ago, we're aiming to try and burn them all in a century because it's cheap power for us. And we'll drive it back to the tropical hothouse of the Carboniferous era 300 million years ago, with other radical changes because the continent's not in the same place. Climate extremes are increasing, and that's become very obvious in the last 5 or 10 years. Severe weather costs are going up. This says last year, but I think this was 2017 or 18, I'm not sure which. The big problem for our society is the Earth has huge memory. And it remembers things for 50, hundreds of years. We don't think in those kind of timescales. And it's very difficult to us to deal with decadal and centennial life timescales. We've avoided responsibility for many decades, and that means everybody, which was why the comment at the beginning about who was sitting in the chair. It's politicians, yes, we can blame them. Professionals are trained to stay in their little silos, and the public. But the underlying issue that we refuse to face is that what we enjoy as business as usual is flatly incompatible with climate change. It's driving climate change. And I'll come back to that. It's linked to the fact we don't manage our technology. We just allow all our waste streams, including the greenhouse gases, to go into the atmosphere and our pollutants to go into the water. We can solve it just by changing the guidelines that we run our society, rather than maximizing profit and externalizing all the costs into the future. And underlying it is simply create a very energy-efficient society based on renewable energy. And we know how to do that. The big challenge for us is that it's a value-based problem at this point. We know what to do. We know what's going to happen. We know it's going to get worse and worse and worse the longer we delay action. It's become a moral issue, way beyond science and economics. And the underlying issue is we have to place value on the future of life on Earth, which seems simple until you start to calculate the costs. Oh, that's not the way, it's not moving. Escape. So here's a pretty picture of the Earth from the 4th of January, and there's me digging in my garden on the 4th of January under a cloudy sky somewhere up there. The greenhouse gases are tremendously important. They keep this planet warm enough for life. They stop it freezing. You take out the greenhouse gases and the Earth freezes over in a few years. But the increase of CO2 further is what's warming us further. The evaporation of more water vapor as the Earth gets warmer triples the effect of carbon dioxide. So it's a huge, positive, fast feedback. And as ice and snow melt, there's less reflection of the sunlight back into space. And this means that the Arctic is warming much faster than the rest of the planet, and our winters are warming faster, particularly the winters without snow. That means the Earth has an energy imbalance. As the gases go up in the atmosphere, the sunlight doesn't change, the reflection by ice and snow goes down, so the Earth has got more energy coming in than it can escape. Think of it, we can't cool fast enough at night, for example. And all that heat, more than 90%, is simply being stored in the oceans every year, on into the future. So we live, this is a very important thing to realize, particularly if you're talking to other people, is that all the energy imbalance of the Earth is being stored in the oceans. And that's driving all the powerful storms that I'll come to in a moment. But something else is happening which really wasn't well understood 10 years ago. The Arctic is warming much faster than the tropics, about twice as fast. And that's changing all the circulation patterns that we associate with those jet streams that used to blow around from the west. Our weather used to just blow quickly past. Now there's lots of stationary weather of various kinds. And when rain systems sit over one spot, for 2 days or 3 days instead of one, you have catastrophic flooding. So I'm going to start with an example of the hurricane season of 2017, which is a simple example of this combination of processes that produced some catastrophic hurricanes that year. The Earth is warming and reflective ice is going down. Oceans are storing 93% of the heat, which meant warmer Atlantic, Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, stronger hurricanes, in years when the vertical shear in the winds are low. And in 2017, we had Harvey, Irma, Jose didn't affect much, and Maria. And they all affected me in one way or another. Harvey was the first. It was incredibly damaging. It was a Category 4 hurricane, warm ocean in the Gulf of a track here, a very heavy rain rate, 10 inches a day, and 2 stationary high-pressure systems basically trapped it right close to the coast for 4 days. 4 days, 10 inches a day equals 40 inches of rain. And it was so massive flooding. It's the first of the most extreme ones of this case in the last few years. And the forecasters had a terrible time. When they saw this forecast, they basically did 2 things. They said, it's so much bigger than anything we've ever seen. They predicted 30, 40 inches of rain over an area much bigger than Massachusetts along the Texas coast. So they alternated between not believing their forecast, hoping it was wrong, and praying it was wrong. But I have one of the examples in there. This is their forecast 36 hours after the start. I'll read it to you. This event is unprecedented. All impacts are unknown and beyond anything experienced. Follow orders to ensure safety. Now, this is not much good as a weather forecaster from the official weather service. On the ground, who are they going to listen to? This is the best the people at Weather Service could do. They never actually predicted 30 or 40 inches of rain for the next 3 or 4 days because they, A, didn't believe it was possible, and B, they knew that it would be catastrophic. This is an honest forecast after 36 hours. But on the ground, people have been encouraged to build in floodplains because the land was cheap, but nobody knew where the floodplains were. People were built downstream of dams that were going to have to open their emergency floodgates or be swept away. People downstream didn't know that they were in the floodplains, those dams. No one had ever told them when they bought and built those houses. And of course, everyone had pretended they couldn't possibly have 40 inches of rain in 4 days, which would mean they'd have to open those floodgates for the dams. But I'm saying this because we are moving into weather conditions that have not been seen before, because, in this case, stationary weather patterns and massive evaporation of the warm ocean. Florence, a year later, was similar. It was only 3 days over land. They were not prepared for that. We are probably better prepared in forecast times in Vermont, but realize that we're moving into new regimes. This is Irma, a couple of weeks later, and it was a critical issue for me because I have my daughter and grandchildren live on St. Thomas, which is here. And his dad, what do we do? I had to become a hurricane forecaster for a few days, and I got them to move to a hotel low down on the south side of the island with hurricane shutters. They evacuated the entire North Shore, and this is the picture just as the eye wall, which has got something like 155, 180 mile-an-hour winds, it's above Category 5, is blowing along the North Shore. Catastrophic damage. I think I have a pretty picture. You don't want to be in a Category 5 storm. Wind just blows through buildings and dumps everything on the outside. Terrifying for my kids and grandkids. And my other daughter used to work on catamarans and was trying to get her out, but Jose was following along behind. They finally got to Puerto Rico, where they lived before, on September the 11th. But on September the 20th, Maria, only Category 4, hit the southeast corner of the island and went straight across. Wiped out all the cell towers and the power grid, and it took, some of it is still not back in operation now. I mention this because I had to deal with this one. They asked me what to do, and there's a storm surge, there's lots of rain, and there's catastrophic winds. They had enough smarts, and they knew the island. They borrowed a car and went down to the southwest corner. But there are narratives on my webpage, writings to the Herald and Times articles of those 2 events, which useful for us in this world here because they give you a glimpse into the world when everything collapses back to no communications and a cash economy, and how you have to then go back to a sharing economy because some people haven't got cash and some people are kept out. It's not just us. Mozambique was hit this year with 2 severe storms in an area traditionally didn't have these, but they had them this year. And this is a picture of people actually smiling. 60 inches of rain from Canada.
Wow.
Up in the northeast, we do statistics, going back 50 years, and very heavy precipitation, which means the upper 1% of rain days are increasing a lot in the northeast United States. Our wake-up call was Irene, now 8 years ago almost. And these are just a pretty picture of, this is 131, the kind of damage, and there's a person down here. You know how long it took to patch those roads back. I don't need to show all these pictures to you, I think, of the catastrophic damage from that. I will show one. There were 2 floods that year. These are in the spring, and I'll come back to that. And this is the Connecticut River runoff from Irene. Massive amounts of stuff washes off our landscape. Massive amounts of pollution and silt, phosphorus, lots of things wash off in these storms into Lake Champlain or into the Connecticut River in this case. It was these are our 2 Vermont classic floods. We had both of them that year. A spring flood, heavy rain, warm weather, melting a large snowpack. Very high temperatures, triple rainfall. And I don't know if you were aware of them down here, because the floods were mostly, in that case, on the rivers out of the Adirondacks and the rivers like the Winooski. I was stunned to go up to Lake Champlain and find the ground-up trees were as tall, above my head. And then it was wet most of the summer. Well, actually, Lake Champlain stayed above flood stage for a couple of months. And then Irene came along, and it rained only about 6 or 10 inches, but on relatively wet ground, so most of it ran off. But if you step back, which you have to do after all these things, to the United States as a whole, this is a picture of, comes again from the Weather Service, and it's the rainfall by state for a 6-month period, March to August, which included both those big events in Vermont. And the ones here in dark red mean that Texas and New Mexico, this 6 months was the driest on record. And these dark greens, 117, there are 117 years of the record in 2011. Meaning that Ohio to Vermont, it was the wettest 6 months in the last 117 years, which is the longest record we have. So you can immediately answer that, and you can say, all the storms that year pretty well avoided Texas and New Mexico and came up the north, and there was this concentration in the northeast. For Texas, this is the drought of record, and for Vermont, this is the flood that we have record that we planned for. But that also means that this pattern, most of the features of it on the global scale, were stationary for that 6-month period. And that aspect of stationary weather is what gave us an extreme and gave Texas the opposite extreme. This is the floodplain of the Otter Creek just west of my house. And every morning I walk down to that covered bridge. This is my morning exercise and wake-up call. And I know, because of this is a railroad sign here, exactly that river rose 10 feet, filled the floodplain 10 feet on this particular storm. We actually have records going back on other floods, and the 1811 flood was also 10 feet above the floodplain. Only the 1927 went higher. It was 12 feet high. But this massive storage of water on the floodplain saved Middlebury. The flow over the dam in Middlebury was half the flow over the dam in West Rutland. It taught us a lot about resilience. 13 towns are cut off overnight. Emergency systems in Waterbury were flooded. FEMA had no road access. But communities here in Vermont simply reorganized overnight. All those cut-off towns got up in the morning, held a town meeting and said, what do we do? Who do we have to feed? Who do we have to look after? And those who had equipment just marched in and said, we can fix this, we can fix this. And some of them worked for staggering amounts of time to build roads out of town. The social networks out of Rutland collected supplies, ran rescue services over the mountains where necessary. Communication is critical, and we still had our communication networks, even though sometimes people had to climb up mountains to get cell service. In the broad sense here, the maintenance of forest cover is critical. Some of the devastating floods we had in the 20s and 30s were because the state was largely deforested. We have to manage water and pollutants because they wash off in floods. But from a water perspective, we have to always think now, not about getting the water to rush off and get it out of our landscape and out of our hair. We have to maximize infiltration because the best place to store water is in the ground. And the preservation of floodplains I've mentioned, and from an equity point of view, just allowing people to put all the trailer parks on the floodplains because it's cheap land is not a good idea. Flooding is increasing for two reasons. One is that warmer temperatures mean higher rain rates, and that's because the evaporation of water and the vapor pressure of water goes up about 4% for every degree Fahrenheit. So you have a hot day, a hot system in the middle of summer, and it's 5 degrees warmer, that means 20% more water vapor in the air. But the second reason is this, that the Arctic is warming faster than the equator. The north-south temperature gradient is going down, and this means that the westerly wind, which is driven by that temperature gradient, is also slowing down, and the jet stream waves are basically getting large waves moving more slowly. And this is happening a lot of the time. Stationary patterns lasting longer. Slow-moving storms mean more rain in one place and more flooding. And Harvey was the example I just showed you. Florence was only 3 days over the coast, but that was catastrophic too. And just last month we had Barry, only a weak little hurricane. But when did you ever hear of hurricanes starting in Kansas? Right? Hurricanes have never started in Kansas. This took 11 days to meander down across northern Florida and then amplify to just a Category 1 hurricane over the Gulf and head up towards Little Rock, Arkansas. You didn't hear much about it because it was only miserable down here in New Orleans where it was already wet. It only did $10 billion worth of damage. But they asked the forecasters, this is very unusual, and they said yes. And the example they brought up of a slow-moving hurricane was Harvey from Houston just a couple of years earlier. Right? So we've never seen this before. But it's an example of what might we have in Vermont? You know, some things forming somewhere. This was just a band of thunderstorms here in Kansas, but it had a distinct identity. It happened to go in an unusual direction, not just off out to sea, back around because of the weather, big controlling weather pattern, amplified to a hurricane over the Gulf. Just what we used to show were these kind of pictures of how, with low and high greenhouse gas emissions, how Vermont's climate would change. With business as usual, by the end of this century, it will be something like northwest Georgia. Right. Which horrifies Vermonters. But I gave this talk one day in Vermont and the next day in Atlanta, Georgia, at Georgia Tech, and the Georgian students just laughed. They said, those Vermonters will have to get used to our weather.
Oh, yeah.
I said nothing, I just looked at them. And they were in a big drought, and the silence could be heard in that room. And after a few minutes, okay, they started to appreciate, well, what would happen to Georgia's weather? Right. And only southwestern Pennsylvania, if we did something about it. But this is already 10 years old. And what we're seeing is, in fact, the whole patterns of weather within the system change in ways we didn't expect. But to pick up the Arctic again one more time, this is the lowest, the Arctic sea ice is a minimum in September. It used to be, minimum was this reddish, purplish colours. And this was the absolute minimum we've seen so far, and that was in 2012. And as I mentioned, less ice, less reflection, and less ice means more evaporation. And more evaporation means more water vapor in the Arctic, and water vapor is a strong greenhouse gas. So this is part of this feedback. Less reflection of sunlight, more greenhouse, and that's why the Arctic is warming twice as fast as the rest. These are the same processes that work in our winters, and I'll touch on that again. But here's, just to show you, this is this year. This is the sea ice cover. This is the 2012 one. And we've been tracking below it or at it down to the beginning of, we're on the 10th of August, I think this one is, the 11th of August. I don't think we're going to break the record, but this is probably going to be the next. We're going to, because we're just a tiny bit above it. The polar vortex weakening, you've started to hear about that. I'll come back to that. Now, what woke me up, really woke me up, was 2007 when I found myself digging over my cover crop in January. And then again in 2008. And I've been gardening in Vermont only 40 years. 77 or 8 was my first garden. And as a Vermont gardener, I never even dreamed, in 1978, that I'd ever be gardening in January. I hung up my spade and the shovel when the ground froze in November, and I got it out in early April if I was lucky. And I'm sure most of you who lived here and understand that past. And here it's January. And this is the shortest frozen period we had. It was only 67 days in this particular early winter. Less than half what used to be normal. And here I am, 15th of January, the year later. And here in 2016, the warmest, snowless winter we've had, this is my granddaughter digging over in February. And I said to her, "Oh, you must be the first kid to be able to dig in Vermont in February since the last interglacial, 100,000 years ago." And she looked up, "Grandpa, what are you talking about?" And of course it was totally untrue. We didn't have spades 100,000 years ago. Okay, here's March 2017, and notice I'm growing all this stuff now just under glass. I get my head lettuce now, typically in April, because I winter over lettuce and spinach, because it just takes a sheet of glass now in any winter. And another example of extremes, this is just last winter, not the one we just passed, the one before. I looked at the outside, it was January the 10th, the minimum temperatures ranged around -10 to -20, and I had kind of assumed that the ground was frozen. And the temperature went up 60, 70 degrees in 24 hours. Whoosh, snow all vanished. I got out my spade, and lo and behold, I was able to dig again. The ground was not frozen in 2018. But this is a real marker. It's like the Arctic ice, and it's Styles Pond in the Northeast Kingdom. And the Eye on the Sky people, I'm sure some of you know their forecasts, have kept track of when it freezes up and when it melts, back to 1971, 72. And this is the freeze update. This is days of the year. And you can see the trend there, you put a line on that, is 4 days per decade. And this is the melt date, and the trend is a little less, it's about 3. So this is the frozen period of Styles Pond, and it's shrunk about 7 days per decade over the last 40 years. But if you look again, the variation from year to year in the last few years is huge. It's as big as the trend over the 40 years. And this is these extreme winter differences we're getting. 2016, 2015, 2017. I don't know if 18 is not on this set. So, trends, but now much more variability in winter. And you've heard on the radio weather forecasts this concept, the polar vortex, the polar vortex. The polar vortex used to be very tight, a tight band that kept the cold air in around the North Pole. But as the North Pole has warmed, the vortexes get unstable, and often these pools of air plunge down into in this case, North America, as the jet stream gets wobbly. And that's happening. But also those patterns have been getting very frozen. And here's an example on kind of a map of the entire planet in a projection here. You can see the continents, North America, South America, Eurasia, Africa. And this is 3-month average, January, February, March 2015, which was a snowy winter for us in North America. And you can see there's a cold band, and this is a temperature difference from the climate. Temperature difference from 1951 to 1980. The dark, warm colors mean that, looking at them, everywhere on the planet, except in North America, it was much warmer or much warmer. These are values around 10 Fahrenheit warmer than the climate reference. But it was colder across North America. We got a lot of snow, and we also, this was the year when Boston got staggering amounts of snow, because it was warm over the ocean, cold over land. But this is the year later, the one where we had almost no snow, very warm, and it's essentially warm everywhere, and there's an El Nino in the Pacific, which was one of the drivers. We never used to get 3 months of weather that was essentially the same. But this is an example of stationary patterns, and enormous differences between the weather. And I think I have one of just this last winter we've just gone through. Very, very cold across North America in February. Extreme cold. But extreme warmth over Alaska, and extreme warmth over Europe, and even the United Kingdom. You probably didn't hear this, but being British, I noticed this was staggering for the United Kingdom, because they had temperatures up to 70 degrees in February. And the peaked moorlands, which are typically foggy and wet, started to burn. Massive fires in the peaked moorlands in England in February. Never happened before. Shocking. But it did wake up the group I will talk about later. March, it was weaker. But, well, we still don't understand these patterns too much. There's a little tongue of cold water off Greenland, from the melt of Greenland. And I think that has something to do with it, but it hasn't been properly analysed yet. Last one of this series is, this is the year ending in June. So July 18 to June 19. And just to show you that the patterns across the United States, this is temperature. So these redder colours mean it was much above average temperature, and these blue colours mean it was much below average. They're not extremes there. But this is the same thing for water. And what's staggering about here, very, very wet, except in the far northwest. And these dark colours here, with the number 124 on them now, mean that this across the central United States, specifically here the Mississippi River, and the eastern and northern United States there, were the wettest years on record. The wettest years on record. And that led to absolutely catastrophic flooding on the Mississippi River this year, the longest flooding on record, and very wet conditions here. So just to give you the sense that we're moving into extremes, whenever we hit these records, and our records only go back, in this case, are now 124 years, we haven't seen it before. I'm going to just step into a couple of things about snowfall, because this is very important to us here in Vermont. And I've done a lot of work on the Canadian prairies, so this figure is actually from Saskatchewan. And what's been done here is we've simply mapped temperature from the date of, think, the first big snowfall. So there's no snow, and then there's snow. And the snow is not that deep here on average, it's only a few inches. And temperature over this transition falls 10 centigrade, 18 degrees Fahrenheit from around freezing. So it falls from 32 down to whatever, 32 down to 14. There's an enormous amount of data in here. There's about 50 years, and there's 5 stations, and there's no missing data. This Canadian data is absolutely fantastic. We have hourly data for 60 years with no missing hours. Well, actually, it's not true. There are a few missing hours on the midnight on the 31st of December. Guess what?
2000?
No, in many of the years.
Oh.
They were celebrating, and they did not fill in the data. And this is a similar one for melt. What happens, you get the snow basically acts as a climate switch, which in centigrade drops the temperature on the prairies, 10 centigrade, 18 Fahrenheit. And you don't get it back until the snowpack melts. In this case, it's March. And then you get that 10 degrees Celsius, 18 Fahrenheit back. So think of snow in a different sense. Think of it switching the climate from one state to another. And that happens in Vermont, except here the change is not 10 centigrade, it's 10 Fahrenheit, because we have forests. We have but before I get to that one, that has such a powerful effect on climate that if you simply plot the number of days with snow cover against the mean temperature of the cold period, you get a beautiful straight line. This happens to be Alberta, where the whole range exists, and again we've got 60 years of data, lots of stations. So, for those of you who like graphs, we think of the climate as normally as this black line going through winter. It's the average of everything, but that's not a helpful way to look at it. If we split the days with snow cover, which are these, blue, and those without snow cover, we get two different lines, and they're separated by 10 centigrade, 18 Fahrenheit. And this is the reality of the way snow changes climate. So think of distinct warm and cold states with snow as a switch. And in Vermont, the fall with snow cover is about 10 Fahrenheit. And that's because the snow is mostly under the trees, although we have open landscape. Someone mapped up just a few years ago the relationship of the sea ice cover in September, so all the last 50, 60 years are there. They put an average, and the trend is downward. And you can see, and they plotted it against the total emissions of our greenhouse gases from the burning of all our fossil fuels. Just to show, it was really rather precise. You put a running mean in here, and you can see how much our emissions of fossil fuel are reducing the sea ice cover, and you can calculate the day when that, on average, is going to disappear. And they calculated, for all us car drivers, how much of the sea ice cover for driving one car with 25 miles per gallon per year, how much are we responsible for, right? And for a typical car, it's 150 square feet of sea ice for every year you drive your car, on into the future. They did this just to make this connection. You drive an inefficient car, and you're responsible for 150 square feet of sea ice. And I guess my next car picture is this one. Just to remind you where we stand. If you go from a gasoline to a hybrid car, you get about a 50% gain in your miles per gallon. When I went to a plug-in hybrid, I went up to 130 miles per gallon. For a car that only has a 30-mile range, but it's the most efficient car on the market. And a lot of my travel in and out of London is local. So I've dropped from basically increased my gasoline mileage by about a factor of 5. And I'm still responsible for about 30 square feet of that sea ice up in the Arctic melt every year. If we shifted to electric tricycles or electric trikes, basically they don't burn any fossil fuel, another factor of 10 fraction. But we are unwilling to think about these things. We're unwilling even to do this, because what is fantastic for me, these cars are much cheaper to run, they don't need much maintenance, and I have dropped my gasoline consumption by a factor of 5 at least, maybe 6. They're not profitable for the dealer. They like to sell big V8 trucks. And they also, when you look them in the eye, and I've done this at the Toyota dealer in London, they say, son, sadly, no Prius owner ever trades their car in every 3 years. They're absolutely nuts to trade their car in every 3 years. But that, from the dealer's perspective, is not good business. So think about it. That's our system. So, ask the question that was on my title somewhere. Can we stop dangerous climate change? We actually promised as a global community 27 years ago now, 1992, that we would stop global climate change. But, promises are cheap. We can, we just have to stabilize atmospheric CO2. Now that means an 80% drop in our CO2 emissions, which I can claim to have accomplished with my car. I've got a few kilowatts of panels out in western Vermont to provide the electricity. It's possible, difficult. And it's difficult because our fossil fuels have driven our industrial growth and our population growth indirectly for a couple of centuries. And particularly for the United States, they've driven all our post-war development. And what we are so proud of in our lifestyle is dependent on fossil fuels. And of course, the other interest is there's a staggering amount of money at stake. It's much cheaper for someone who has $10–20 trillion worth of fossil fuels to bribe politicians, to provide misinformation, and to stop the system from doing anything about it. We thought 2015 was a transition year. We had the climate meeting in Paris, and then 188 nations made national commitments of what they were going to do. It wasn't really enough, but they, A, said they would make them, and B, they said they would tighten them up every year. It hasn't happened. They made them, and we've done a little bit, but there was also the encyclical from Pope Francis on the environment, which mapped out how the exploitation of the earth and the poor are now inseparable. Got a little publicity in the United States outside the Catholic Church. He said short-term profit as our primary motive is simply immoral. And he ordered the Catholic Church to act. But there's been a lot of institutional resistance, even in the United States and elsewhere. Okay, then along came our present government, we cancelled our commitments, and all the reports since then, I'm just citing one that came out recently, said 1 million species will be gone this decade or two from habitat loss and climate change, which is why your corridors are important here. Just to show you the growth of CO2, give you a sense of that, this is global emissions of, there's a two that can come up, carbon dioxide. Rapid growth through the 2000s when we moved all our industrial production, a lot of it to China, and they built cheap coal-fired plants, polluted their cities tremendously. They shifted to renewables on a vast scale in the 2010 onwards, and we thought we had just, in 2015, stabilized the system. Not good enough, because we have to come down 80%, but we stabilize it. No. It's creeping up again. And even at these levels, which are 80% too high, CO2 in the atmosphere is, of course, going up steadily. Okay. So people now ask, how much can we safely burn? We want to be safe. How much can we safely burn? Well, we were trying, when we wrote the Paris Agreement, to keep the warming of the average for the planet below 2 centigrade, 3.8 Fahrenheit. And that's only through 750 gigatons. That means leaving 2/3 of the remaining fossil fuels in the ground, and at our present rate, that's only about 20 years. At lower thresholds, it's only 10 years. And if we were to really work down, we could get a longer period. But you can see the real difficulty right there. We know how to do it. Well, systems engineering. We changed the rule book from maximizing profit at the expense of the earth. Minimize lots of things, maximize efficiency. You can read that list later. In simple terms, we have to double or triple our energy efficiency. The reason we have such an energy inefficient society here is simply because we had cheap fossil fuel through the big growth phases. Europe only uses half the amount of energy per capita, and key countries do the same things. They build energy efficient buildings and more efficient cars. We still don't have legislation to do that. We can't replace our current fuel use with the renewables and biofuels. And if we just go on burning them, CO2 will end up at 1,000 parts per million, and there won't be much left. Sea level will come up about 100 feet, and that at least will slow down the coastal cities. We have to have a creative approach to the future. We can run an efficient society on renewables, but that needs vision and deep change. We have to work with the Earth's biosphere and manage water and forests and things like this. But we live in this, it's a free country attitude, and we don't pay any attention to the consequences. Most of these things you have to think about. The American dream, well, the American dream, you all know that in some form, it's crumbling. It was economic growth based on fossil fuels, debt, consumerism, and dumping all the waste streams. It's become a disaster for the planet. There's a technology part to it. We don't guide and manage technology. And the fundamental problem is that we have individual rights, we have corporate rights, but we don't have anything to balance our needs of humanity against the needs of the Earth's ecosystem. The Earth basically has no rights. There are a lot of lawsuits going on around the globe trying to give real legal rights to the Earth, but none of them have succeeded yet. They're coming close in some European countries. So the catastrophe. We have a complex living systems here. Both Earth and our society is nearing collapse. What I'm going to cheerfully call fossil capitalism, because it's capitalism based on cheap fossil fuels, as well as being a fossil product at this point, is incompatible with the livable Earth. But there's social and political resistance to change. And because corruption in the system at many levels, which has been there through the past few decades, but it's become very explicit in the last few years. But at last, the moral issues are surfacing. People have grasped, and this was the youth, and Greta in Sweden is largely responsible for this. We're sacrificing our kids. We claim to revere and protect our children, but we're actually sacrificing them. When did we believe in? When did we start to believe in child sacrifice? And the extinction of species in a stable biosphere is a huge issue. We do depend upon it, and certainly the poorer nations depend upon it. I might have to turn this down a little bit. I think you can still hear me, but it's getting some feedback. But the global rebellion has started. You know part of it. You know about the school strikes that came from Greta's work. The first was March the 15th, 123 countries, more than 1 million around the world decided they would strike. The next one is a very important one, is coming up, and we will see a lot around here in Vermont as well. And put right down, if you don't know it, September the 20th, Friday, September the 20th, is the first day of a week of demonstrations, youth groups, basically strikes to make this climate point. And Greta is sailing across the Atlantic in an ocean-going, well, not really an ocean-going, actually a racing sailing boat, in time to be here for that. And she's going to speak to the United Nations on the 23rd of September. That's her. She's only 16 years old. She'd been thinking about it, she said, for 7 years. And she could not stop. She had to do something. Otherwise, how was she going to face her children? And she's a very good and clear speaker. I have another slide here, and you don't have to read these details. She simply rode her bike down and sat there with a school strike. School strike for climate. A little one here. We can't change the world by playing by the rules, when people said she should be in school, because the rules have to be changed. And when they really pinned her down and said, why aren't you in school? You have to learn something. And she says to them, I have done my homework. You have not. And she's been talking to all the global leaders of various things. We'll see how Trump deals with that. The other one, has anyone here heard of the Extinction Rebellion? You have, yes. But I'm stunned by this. This is the biggest global thing that has happened this year, and somehow the media have managed to keep it out of the US attention. So I'll just map it out for you. A group meeting over, since the last fall, but basically over the winter, in Britain, decided, this climate and the extinction of species issue is a civil rights issue. Not a civil rights issue for us, it's a civil rights issue to defend for our children and to defend the rights of the earth. They thought about it over the winter. They sent out hundreds of people across the whole of the UK to talk to all the local groups to explain what they were going to do and why. And they said, this is a civil rights issue. We've never been able to deal with these. And you can see how little government has done unless we use non-violent civil disobedience. And what they did is they sent 100,000 people to London on the 15th of April, and they simply shut London down with a street party. Closed the bridges, closed the government, closed all the big corporations. And they said, we're here until you tell the truth to the British people and declare a climate emergency. And the government held out for only 3 days. 3 days. They were so beautifully organized, they would arrest 50 people here, in 5 minutes, 500 would show up. And the system collapsed. And they got, England and Scotland declared a climate emergency. And a few other countries are following. At this point, though, it's still symbolic. Because what they next want, and you need to know their website, it's just rebellion.earth. Think of it as the first rebellion to save the earth. We are kind of slow on this one, as you can appreciate, but it's having a big impact in Europe, and even the oil companies admitted that they don't know how to deal with this because they're going to be real targets soon. They're pushing for very large reductions this decade, and things like a few decades simply illegal. Think of it also as the carbon abolition movement, analogies to things like slavery and all the other issues we've had to fight. So that's actually the end of my talk. I'm just going to list here a few of the local groups. Fridays for Future is the website for all these things about strikes for climate on Fridays, rebellion.earth. And my website, you'll find this talk there. And for those who love little handouts, this is the entire talk on 5 pages. And basically, it's time for questions. But it's also time for us to get real about this problem. It's not going to go away. The earth wins it hands down. And I say now over and over again, when you think about doing something, buying something, whatever it is, ask the question, is this good for the earth or not? My advice is back the earth, because the earth is going to win this against our economic system. Can I just open it to all of you for questions? And I probably will repeat them if we can only hear them. Yes, please.
I just want to, how I came to the conclusion when you said that the polar vortex makes much more change than does the equator. And that's because a few degrees at the north or south poles will get everything to melt, whereas a few degrees at the equator will not get anything to do anything.
It just warms. Yes, so think of what's happened
Okay.
so far is that the equator's warmed up about a degree on average, but the poles have warmed up on average about 2 or 3 degrees, and much more at certain times of the year. So Greenland is melting, or ice in the Arctic is melting. There are fires burning across the Arctic, and the fires put soot out into the atmosphere, and the soot comes down on the ice and makes it darker, so it melts faster. And where there's less ice means more evaporation, and water vapor triples the effect, basically. So there's lots of things going on up in the Arctic that are amplifying the warming.
I was thinking of it just as degrees. So.
Well, the degrees isn't important. Think of it being 2 or 3 times.
Yeah.
And the same thing is happening. You look at how much our summers are warming, on average, even though they're getting much more extreme. Well, maybe not the summers, but the winters are. On average, our winters are warming twice as fast as the summers. And that's because of the snow issue. If it gets warmer, we lose the snow, and we don't get the snow, there's an automatic step shift in our climate. So the winters, for example, like 2016, with very little snow cover, have to be a lot warmer.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Yes?
You know, just a comment on a place that I saw a number of years ago. We think in terms of carbon dioxide from exhausts and burning fires and stuff. We drove through a town appropriately named Cold Strip, Montana. Apparently one of the biggest electric generating stations in the country. They burned 3 rail cars full of coal. I think it was within just a couple of minutes. That was the velocity at which they were burning coal, and you know, there was just a great plume of smoke coming out of this huge stack. I don't know whether they're still in operation or not, but that was that's something apart from things like electric vehicles and things of that sort that we need to change. There are other ways on the plains to generate electricity.
Well, we have seen a quite rapid growth of wind turbines on the
Right.
plains, and off-sea ones also, where the winds blow a little bit more regularly. Our ability to store electricity has gone up enormously in the last few years, just as we have batteries for electric cars. We also have now stationary storage facilities. But that technology is advancing quite rapidly. And in some places, but there's many places where we haven't really implemented, like think of the islands in the Caribbean. A few of them have consciously gone to renewable power, and some of them are still importing oil. And, but you know how that works. If you live on, say, Martha's Vineyard and someone wants to build a wind farm that you can see, it's an insult.
Ours.
Horrors of horrors, yes. You just want cheap power.
Yeah.
So it's not in my backyard attitude, and no thought of the long-term consequences. That we have what we have because of cheap fossil fuel, which we controlled for a long time. And you remember, OPEC was the first to rebel, and we had a crisis. And then Iran kicked out the Shah, which we had imposed so we could recapture their oil supply. And we complained, this is unfair, these are terrorists, etc., etc., etc. They're simply taking away our right to exploit everything. And then all our invasions of Iraq, when the first one they took away our control of Kuwait's supply, and then we decided we would fabricate an excuse to attack them so we could perhaps capture control of the oil fields of Iraq. And we ended up destroying, getting the chaos in the Middle East we have now. Now we're trying to take over Venezuela. We drilled those oil wells. They're our oil wells, is the attitude. And we don't care how many people starve and die there. We're going to squeeze them until somehow, well, what's happening now with China is developing those oil fields. And how are we going to deal with that? Well, we'll apply sanctions on China because China is trying to find its, get its oil supply. I read a book I haven't mentioned here, Oil, Power and War.
Could you say it again?
Oil, Power and War, by a French author, Arsenal, I think is his name. But if you just Google Oil, Power and War, you will learn more about the interplay of oil, power and war in the last century than I thought I was well educated. When I read that book, I learned so many things I did not know. Basically, our oil and war strategy has controlled our policy for 100 years, and it still does. Most of it's been done in secret.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I'm reminded of another town that we drove through. This one was in Canada. I've forgotten just where. This was back in the, would have been late 60s, no, early 70s, when the concern wasn't global warming, it was acid rain. And I don't remember the name of the town. It'll come to me as soon as I shut up. But one of the things that struck me at the time as we drove into this town was that all of a sudden there was no vegetation around. There were no trees on the hills and so forth. Well, that was an issue here in Vermont. But what were they putting out? Carbon dioxide. It mixed with rainwater and produced hydrochloric acid, or the equivalent.
It was sulfates.
Sulfates, right.
Not just
And
the carbon dioxide.
the carbon dioxide
SO2
also,
was the acid part of it.
Yeah, it was a
And
combination.
we regulated that. We absorbed it, and we managed to cut it back substantially.
Yeah.
You hear a lot of things, regulation is considered an evil on the far right, but nobody discusses what happened over the ozone layer. Does anyone here recall back in the ozone layer? That was one of our greatest environmental triumphs of the last century. The vote for that global treaty, does anyone know the vote in the Senate for that global treaty was? It was 98-0. Reagan and then George H. Bush understood the issue. They believed the scientific community. They said we have to stop this. And we would already be deep into an ozone catastrophe if they hadn't acted. But they set up a global system, and we've sort of controlled it. Now we find there's some leakage in parts of China from making phones. But someone's going to go in there and shut it down. Because everyone is taking responsibility globally for the gases that deplete ocean ozone. Because it's a catastrophe for life on Earth. Not just for us getting sunburn, but for all of the living stuff on the Earth. So, yes, we can do these things. And we've been able to do a few of the small ones, like control acid rain. But this is the big one. It depends on us challenging the structure of our economic system. And the capitalist system we have has been fueled by oil and its byproducts. It doesn't pay for any of the long-term costs. And we're not willing to face that because there's so much money involved, and money buys corruption in the society. Yes?
We talk a lot about fossil fuels, but what about our incredible appetite for meat?
Oh, that's another issue, isn't it?
It's a huge issue that there's that piece. And then the other thing I just remembered I wanted to comment on, I just recently read a book called We Do Things Differently by the futurologist, Michael Sullivan, I believe his name is. He's a British author, and it was all about innovations that are happening all over the world. Very, very exciting, really exciting, talking about batteries, how they're creating these batteries, and the Dearman motor that actually runs on carbon from the air, and I mean, it's very exciting stuff. And I think that we need to be thinking about those innovations, because otherwise we become incredibly depressed, and we have to educate ourselves to what we can do on a personal level every day, and I think otherwise we'll all just shrivel up, because it's pretty overwhelming when you consider how long this has been going on, and how these people who are in charge of the fossil fuel companies have known for 40 or 50 years that this is happening. It's criminal, and nobody is being held accountable.
I understand all this important meat. You're absolutely right. A UN report came out, I think, a few weeks ago on the catastrophic state from a planetary perspective of our agriculture and food system.
Burning of all the forests. What about that?
All these things are going on, and yes, but don't get depressed. The central issue that we haven't yet discussed at all is that we actually have to cooperate with the earth. We thought we could just do what we like to. After all, it doesn't really matter, does it? We are the important people.
I think that here in Vermont, we are so close to that already.
Right.
But then how are you going to, I mean, if you think taking guns away from these guys, try to take their trucks away from them. I mean, come on.
Come on, right. What we should be doing is giving our teenage kids at 14 or 15, before they can drive, electric assist bikes. They could become mobile for no cost, no insurance, nothing. And some of them would make the transition to mobility without having to buy old trucks and go down that particular path. We haven't gone that route. We would have to build more bike lanes, of course, but fantastically cheap in every way compared to with what we get right now, which we put them into old trucks and they move down the track. Yes. There's a lot of places of points of entry here, but the connectedness to the earth is a very, very important one. It's easier for us here in Vermont to reconnect with the earth and essentially start to ask for the help of the earth system. The earth is much more cooperative when you cooperate with it. And that goes very, very deep. And so that's one of my pieces of advice. And it's also, just as community gives you strength, stay connected to your community. The connection to the earth also gives you strength. And that is very helpful in this. There's an enormous amount to do, and I've just sketched over the surface. There's many things. But don't get depressed. Look for the points of hope. Look for the points of creativity. Yes, there's lots of things going on around the world. If we have to implement them at scale. Not just say, they're nice and they're cute, but not be willing to pay for them. Because someone's going to turn around within our economics and say, yes, but not cost effective. And cost effective means it's somehow reduced my profits this month, this quarter. You have to be able to look them in the eye and say, but is it cost effective for my kids? Is it cost effective for the earth? Absolutely not. It's, as you said, it's a crime what we are doing. And people are trying to establish the rights of the earth and the crime of ecocide, which is destruction of the earth's ecosystem. At the moment, we can do what we like to the earth system, everywhere. It's not a crime. And this is unthinkable, but that's how our society grew up. It grew up because, for example, in America, we could always move west and push away the native people. We had no thought for them. That was just the culture. But the earth as a whole now is living beyond its limits. Yes, we have too many people. We certainly eat too much meat. You should know where your food comes from. So the localization of food in this community, which is going on in Vermont, is tremendously powerful. Because then you know where that food came from. You know whether it came from an industrial farm. You know whether it was grass-fed or whatever it was fed. You know more about it, and you can make much wiser decisions to limit what you eat. Yes?
Just the thought now of what the kids in elementary school are learning in their science classes compared to what they should be learning in their science classes. Maybe up here, everybody is doing that already.
Yes, I can speak to that.
I thank you. But I know that it is not happening for my granddaughter. And, so I have to be the one who is individually, talking to her as best I can. But I also show Al Gore's 2005 movie, which is sort of out of date, but the students that I have in a community college are like, they don't know. They think that when people have said, oh, this is all a lie, that that's the truth. And then they see that the ways that have changed visually on the screen in front of them, and they realize, I've got to make some changes. And we've got to change the science programs.
Work on it.
Yes, I am.
You had a question back there.
Yeah, in an oversimplistic way, I guess, to say that burning wood, fuel, oil, and coal is bad. Having wind, solar, and thermal is good. My curiosity is, where does nuclear fit on that line?
Well, that's yet another topic. And I can hear them calling me. The problem with nuclear is not the one that's discussed. The problem is nuclear power is it makes plutonium. We have enough plutonium to destroy the planet already, and its half-life is 20,000 years.
Right.
Nobody
Storage is a problem, but it
Yeah.
doesn't cause a problem.
At the source. It's the waste stream again that's a problem. And so, yeah, now there are dreams that we can produce really nice little compact nuclear power plants that will not blow up by accident, etc., etc., etc. And we will see whether that technology goes anywhere. But the fundamental problem with nuclear power is plutonium. We have how much plutonium, how many nuclear bombs can Vermont build from the plutonium that's poorly stored on the banks of the Connecticut River? Do you know?
But maybe it can be burned for fuel.
Yes, maybe it could be burned.
Maybe technology will, I'm just asking.
I know all these questions, it's hundreds, by the way. We could build, we're a storage of 100 nuclear power. It's another topic, yes. It is deep thought, not superficial thought, and careful management of waste streams. Yeah.
I'd like to ask if we could just have maybe 2 more questions. And then certainly if people want to have more discussion afterwards individually, but some people want to move and need to go. But let's just have 2 more questions and then open it up to just personal discussion if people want to have more comments.
Can I have one from the far back?
Hi. So I'm thinking about, this is kind of all over the place, but I'm thinking about how in the 70s and 80s and 90s, all of our industry went to Asia. So we destroyed our economy and we destroyed the source of income for most people, and we've never recovered. And the only people who made money from that are the CEOs and the stockholders. And also in doing that, it means it was cheaper to ship raw materials over there, halfway around the world, and then ship them back, which makes no sense to me at all. So part of me is thinking we need to be more sort of isolationist in the way we grow our economies. I'm just sort of wandering around those thoughts. I wonder if you had some thoughts
Yeah,
about that.
think of it not as isolate, but localization.
Okay.
We
yeah.
need to relocalize almost everything
Mhm.
so we can see it, we control it, we can understand it, and we can ask the fundamental questions about it.
And
We're
so-
not dumping waste streams somewhere else.
And so how can we, it would be really neat to figure out what every country can make locally, and this is of course idealistic, but what everybody can do locally, and then trade or buy and sell with each other based on what we're able to produce ourselves.
You'll have to think about that
Yes, I'm.
with a group of people. Your question.
Well, thank you, Dr. Betts, for underscoring the catastrophe that is with us and that is going to grow even worse. And I like your call for social revolution. But can't we do something at the same time that uses our forces today to do something about it? For example, we have established for Vermont lofty goals.
Right.
We've done a pitiful job in getting there.
Exactly.
We've done virtually nothing, and you've pointed out that it is the social and political resistance against it. And Jim has pointed out the deniers that exist. And you've pointed out, too, the powerful money interests of fossil fuels that have spread disinformation and that are able to control so much. Yet, at the VCON conference in December of last year, Energy Action Network set up drivers for the 10 top drivers that would get us to the reduction in carbon emissions by 2025 that have been set up. And they include massive operations in heating and transportation, which are the two main issues that need to be addressed for reduction of carbon emissions. Must we not, at the same time as encouraging our kids to do social revolution, we can't waste for that. We must do something today, can we not?
Absolutely.
In heating and transportation, just as you have given us an example.
Well, of course you can. There are countries in Europe that have gone through and retrofitted their housing 10% every year for 10 years. We haven't done that in Vermont. We could do that. Then you'll have to just go with the arguments that people have about, we can't afford to do this, we're not going to pay for it, etc., etc. But we must. So yes, keep pushing. Keep doing all those things. We need to address transportation and heating. We need to make people's houses more efficient. We know how to do it. But why are we not willing to pay that little bit of money to save life for our kids? That's unreasonable. That's not just unreasonable, that's a crime. We need to be able to look our politicians in the face when they talk about, we can't have a tax to do that. We can't have a fossil fuel tax. We can't have this, we can't have that. They're just protecting the system. Realize that. They're basically lying to protect the system, to be very impolite about it. Yes, we need to do all those things, as well as support our youth. Well, I'll take one more.
This isn't a question, it was just a comment about
Yes.
that, because I don't think necessarily it's the politicians, I mean, on their own that are saying, oh, we're not going to do that. I just happen to think about how, I can't remember, Elon Musk's brother was going to put solar panels on all of these homes in Arizona, and when he announced that he was going to do it and how long it would take him to do this, they went in, the Koch brothers went in and, basically lobbied against it. So they did away with all of the solar incentives that Arizona had put out there. And so virtually overnight, that whole plan was gone. And you know where he went? Australia. And he's doing it in Australia.
Well, I'm glad he's doing it somewhere.
That's correct.
It is a
But-
planet, it's one planet,
Yeah.
yes. But you're just putting your finger on it. Yeah. So, I am encouraging you. I can't hide the truth. It's a big problem. It involves all facets of society. We have to stay grounded. Oh, one last thought. How many people here know Earth Walk in Vermont? The Earth Walk. Earth Walk. It's a project further north than here, where they take kids into, I think, one afternoon a week in a local school, and they take them into the natural environment. And the kids are all now trained to connect with the natural world. There's these delightful pictures of, a 6-year-old girl, of course, feeding a tiny little bird in her hand, absolutely frozen and still. And those kids, there's a transition for them. They're boisterous and playing, and they come to the edge of this sacred place, and they drop into the silence. And they do it every day. There's just one school here that takes the children into the natural world and reconnects them at a very young age. Earth Walk, Google it. It's in here in Vermont. It's an example of something we could be doing for our kids everywhere. Reconnecting them so they really know what is going on. And then you can, in the classroom, they will accept a lot of the other things that are different. Yes, it means retraining teachers. But most teachers have a pretty good idea of what really is going on out there if they are supported by the community to make that change. So push for change. Connect to each other. Connect to the earth. And then come back in a year or two and discuss how much we've got. And watch what's going on this fall very carefully and support it. Thank you for listening.